So, so I'm Raquel, and if I haven't met everybody on here in person, so if we don't know, I am the director of Oak Tree, and I've been that for I guess about 2 years now. Um, but I grew up in a Christian home, family, grandparents in ministry on both sides. Went through multiple denominations, multiple Christian schools, so I have definitely seen a wide scope of evangelicalism in America. Um, and that's kind of a big foundation of why God has brought me to this point, I think. But I naturally like questioned a lot as a kid. I easily saw blind spots in the church and history and in school, and I just had a ton of questions. And it wasn't until recently that I have discovered that God made me that way intentionally, and a lot of hard things of me pushing back out of curiosity and wanting to have a fuller understanding. I'm learning now that God has wired me that way, and I can use that as a gift to help other people who maybe haven't had these questions. Um, and yeah, and so that's why I'm excited to be on this journey, and that people are willing to jump into books like this and discuss things and really dive into those hard questions and wrestle. Um, and I was pretty young when God kind of made it clear to me that I was going to be in ministry and serving in dangerous place. I didn't know fully what that meant, and I never expected it would be here in Birmingham, but was always aware of that. And so we got to remember, my generation is one I grew up with Columbine, 9/11, Left Behind series. Pretty early on was called to count the cost and to say, is it worth it? And there's going to be times where you're standing alone on truth and you might get pushed back. And so as really young was like, yeah, I think Jesus is worth it, and I think the truth is worth it. Um, and I've had the privilege of traveling the world and learning from the global church and having a fresh perspective coming back into America at a unique time. I didn't expect that I would still be here. I was planning to move to the Middle East, ready to go learning Arabic. But I moved back to Birmingham in 2014, and the Lord made it clear I was going to stay here. And again, coming in back into America with this fresh perspective of not purely an American or Southern evangelical worldview, but a larger view made me see Ferguson different as I came back into America at a unique point in history. And so since then, since 2015, well, 2014, we've really been wrestling through a lot of these questions and studying race, studying our history, and studying the church's role and what does reconciliation mean and what could it look like for us. And so I started serving in Eastlake in 2015, and soon after that officially joined the Oak Tree team, and never expected. Again, it's all just been God kind of directing, and um, yeah. And so now, as I mean, this is a confusing and messy journey. Um, it's one that I'm really grateful for so many of you on the screen that we've been wrestling through this stuff for a while now, but there's so much here. This is not easy, and we're not going to solve everything in 5 weeks at all. But we're also not going to shy away from the hard stuff. We're here to lean into that together. And so, again, like I've been trying to learn about this stuff for 5 years now, and I'm only scratching the surface. Um, and and we're at a unique point. When Ahmaud Arbery's case came out, there was a new awakening, like I have not seen within the white community, especially, but within the church, speaking up more on injustice and on racial issues and on the division. Um, and if I'm honest, it's been a wrestling for me, to with deep struggle of anger mixed with hope. Um, and there's space for both of those, and there's got to be space for both of those in this group, because like it's confusing and messy, and it's long overdue that the church addresses these things. Um, but I'm encouraged that we're doing it now. and that do believe the witness of the church depends on it. As we read in John 17 before coming to this group, that Jesus prayed for us to be one. We can be one. It's his prayer, it's his mission, it's his goal. And in that prayer, he says, by our oneness, by our love, then the world will know that he is true, that he was sent, and that we are his. And so that's why I'm really passionate about this. That's just a little bit of my story to show. And as a preteen, through because I'm really observant and question things a lot. As a kid, seeing things in the church that people would rather have brushed under the rug and not giving me clear answers, not being honest and open about sin, trying to cover things up instead, is what made me want to leave the faith and made me question if God was true and if he was trustworthy to follow. And so that's another reason I'm really passionate about this, is I believe that if we share things and talk about it, um, there's more space for people to see that God is good and he's trustworthy. And I know if I almost walked away, if it made me start to doubt my faith, that there are others that have that. And I've talked with people around Birmingham that have stories of, they're not rejecting Jesus, they're rejecting the church that has let them down on issues like this. And so that's why I'm passionate about it. And yeah, and so I'm excited to see what God's going to do through this as we make space to go on this journey together. So I'm going to set just the tone and foundation of our time together. Like I said, I'm sorry I'm talking a lot at the beginning, but after that, I want to hear from everybody, and then we'll discuss the first chapter. But I've realized in this, a lot of people agree more than they realize, but because they don't have the same vocabulary and foundation of understanding, it's creating more arguments than are necessary. So in order for us to have these conversations and it be productive, we've got to have a starting point, a baseline. And so I'm going to kind of lay that for us. So first off, we're going to be color brave, not color blind here. That's something that Latasha Morrison talks about a lot. But colorblind has been something that, because we're in a racialized society, there's been a lot of shame connected with our colors and how God specifically made us. And we're going to learn to not let shame have that say, but to celebrate our differences, that God intentionally designed us uniquely, and that's something to celebrate. And we might for the first time feel confident in talking about that, or understanding how we're different and how that's not a bad thing. And that we are, like I said, there's a lot more that ties us in unity than separates us, but we're not going to cover up or be afraid of who we are. We're going to see that God wants us to celebrate who he made us to be. And then if you've been at Oak Tree at all, everything we do is layered in trauma-informed care. And that might be a new concept for some of you, but I'm going to bring this in and talk, share it in this context. Think about America as a whole. We have a history of trauma after trauma after trauma. It started out with trauma. It started out with removal of Indigenous peoples in a traumatic way. It grew by trauma of stealing people from another place and building up our economy based on humans. And so that's trauma. And so we cannot expect now that we are untouched by that reality. We talk all the time about the impacts of trauma are passed down through generations at Oak Tree. And that's the same. We're not that far removed. I remember as a kid in history class sitting there and reading about the civil rights movement and when Dr. King was murdered. And I remember looking at that and doing some math, because the feeling in the room was, this was so long ago, look how far we've come. And I remember doing the math and going, that's the year before my parents were born. And I was like, that's not long ago. And so we have to acknowledge that this is not that long ago. We are still living in impacts of trauma as a society. And so with that, we have to practice mindfulness. because we're going to be doing a lot of self work in this group. There's going to be a lot of self examination. Um, at Oak Tree with the kids, we say all the time there's not bad feelings, there's just feelings. There's bad reactions to our feelings, but the feelings themselves are from God and they have a purpose. So we have to practice mindfulness. We need to be aware of our triggers. So a trigger is just anything that ignites a really strong emotional or physical response. It's when we talk about it at Oak Tree when the kids flip our lids, right? So if our brain, I do this all the time, this is where we think, our prefrontal cortex, this is our amygdala. Fear response, amygdala is the one thinking. We can't learn, we're not being rational, we're trying to protect ourselves. And so we have to be aware when this is happening in us, be mindful of when we're being triggered by something. Because as adults, when we receive information that doesn't match our worldview or something that's just uncomfortable, we want to defend ourselves, we're reacting with our fear brain, wanting to protect. And so you may not feel safe, but we are safe here, right? And so we have to be mindful. We have to be aware. Am I wanting to fight, flight, or freeze right now, right? Like, what is our natural response? And so as we acknowledge, okay, I feel like I want to defend. I feel like I want to correct someone. I feel like I want to tell them this. I feel like that's not true. As we start acknowledge, like, why am I feeling this? What is that emotion trying to tell me? Because we want to respond in truth. We don't want to respond out of our emotion. We're here to learn new things, and when we learn new things, it's going to be challenging. It may be things that we've never openly discussed before. It may be things we've never heard of before. And this group is coming from all different backgrounds. We've got different race, culture, denomination, personality, ages, generations. Like, we're coming together because that's what Christ calls us to. His family is beautifully diverse. And so we can have these differences. We can hold different opinions and we can learn from each other and strengthen each other, but not if we're in defense mode. This group is not about being comfortable, right? God calls us to unity, not comfort. So you might get to squirming, and that's okay. So again, it's going to be brave space. Again, you might not feel safe. What feels safe to me might not feel safe to you. And we have to acknowledge that, that as we talk about things, I might feel fine, but I might be making somebody else really uncomfortable. So this is going to be brave space. We're choosing to step in. Um, we're going to enter with a spirit of humility and a desire to learn. That whole first chapter on humility is key. This is foundational. We have to enter this conversation humbly. Um, so just the basics of walking with Jesus, we're going to be slow to speak. We're going to be quick to listen. We're going to be patient with one another and recognize how much grace and patience Christ has for us. And we're not going to assume that we know what someone is saying. We're not going to assume someone else's motives or meanings. We're going to give the benefit of the doubt. So we're going to assume the best, and then we're going to ask clarifying questions. We're not going to judge one another for questions. We're going to have space to say, oh, what did you mean by that? I don't understand this, but we're not going to. Right now, our world is super polarized. So when I say one thing, all of a sudden people assume they know what I mean by that because they've been told that this word means this, and it's just really unhelpful. So we have to see each other. This is relationship, and we're coming together because even trauma happens through relationship. Healing happens through relationship. That's what we say all the time at the treehouse. It is no different here. The world is broken. Christ's plan is reconciliation, and that happens through relationship. But to do that, we have to give one another benefit of the doubt and learn. And this is a process of gaining trust, the same way we talk about with our kids. You have no reason, if I don't know you, you have no reason to trust me, right? And so we have to acknowledge that too of, okay, I may not trust this person that way, but how can I still lean in and learn from them and then start to gain trust? Um, so yeah, we're not going to accuse or keep a record of wrongs, right? Love is not about that. We're going to celebrate vulnerability and honesty, which can be really hard over Zoom, but we're going to create space for that. And I just want to say we need to enter this conversation with a strong theology of sin. And what I mean by that is you can't be in the work we do and not have a big understanding of the impacts of sin. Um, Otherwise, you're going to constantly be shocked or discouraged or confused. Um, the fall has impacted the world, and we all know that. But until you step into some of the most broken parts, sometimes we don't realize how much we don't acknowledge that. And so we're going to acknowledge that sin has impacted the entire world and it's impacted us. Sometimes it's easy for us to acknowledge how much sin has impacted the world in this vague way, and we don't realize that it's impacted us in this way. And so we're going to acknowledge that racism has impacted all of us in different ways, but we have been born into a very racialized society. And so it would be very naive to believe that the sin of racism has not impacted us in some way. Um, and with that, as we have a high view of sin, we understand its power. We also have a high theology of Christ's work on the cross and redemption, right? We know who has more power than sin. Um, but without that redemptive power, um, yeah, sin's just going to grow and grow and grow. But we can walk into this and not have complete shock and despair as we look at the depth and reality of sin. We can move forward with confidence and with hope because we know that if we follow Christ's plan, then we can defeat sin, right? He gives us power over that by shining light on it, by confessing it to one another, by asking for forgiveness, by learning what repentance means. So we can move forward with confidence and excitement, even as it's scary. Um, and so we're going to first wrestle with the sin in our own hearts, the racism in our own hearts, the prejudices in our own hearts. Then we can work to fight against sin and racism in our communities. Um, we have to do that together, and we can't be running around pointing out the plank in everyone or the speck in everyone else's eye, ignoring the planks within our own. And so again, this is a lot of personal work that I hope that we lean into as God takes us on this journey over the next couple of weeks. So another thing, I'm going to just speak specifically to our white brothers and sisters on this group. We can enter this and you don't have to prove that you're a good white person. Okay, so let your guard down. You're already at the table. You've already entered here. This isn't a competition. We're not keeping score. We don't need you to prove why you're not like those white people, that you've done these good things for Black people or you have Black friends. We don't need that. That's not beneficial for us right now. So just let your guard down. Like I said, all of us have been impacted by racism in different ways, and that's just truth. And so we can move forward. We have all made mistakes, but we're not trying to prove right now or defend ourselves. So just let your guard down, take a deep breath. This is space to wrestle with everything the questions that we have, the experiences we've had. And so as a group, we're going to sit in the uncomfortable fact that we have privileges. And I'll talk about white privilege a little bit later in that term and how it's really confusing right now. But whether by race or economics or just our American citizenship, we have different privileges. And so that's a reality. It's nothing to condemn us. Um, it's fact. And so we're going to sit in that. We're going to be uncomfortable. We're going to listen to what Christ would tell us about our privileges and our purposes behind them. Um, And so it's okay to get uncomfortable in that. Um, we're not going to defend, we're going to confess and repent, right? Defense and excuses doesn't help us grow. Confession and repentance and lamenting, that helps us grow. And we don't do that naturally. So we're going to take time to learn what that means as we go further in the book. And then just another thing that I'm seeing so much right now, and we don't realize that we do as white people, but it is an impact of racism in our country, and is that we're not going to expect for every Black person in this group to give us all the answers. If we need to do some work and some homework on our own, we're going to go do that. We're not going to put further pressure on them when there's been immense pressure, especially in the last few months, on them. And we're not going to further dehumanize people of color as a whole by lumping them all into one category and by saying, well, this Black person says this, so all Black people believe this, right? Or, well, what about this? Because this is what Black people believe, and this is what Black people told me here. In the same way that we pride ourselves in seeing white people as individuals, we've got to lean in and recognize that when we do that, and when we say, hey, watch this video because this is a Black person defending what I believe, that is further dehumanizing Black people in our minds, whether we do that intentionally or not. So there is diversity of opinions within all the different people of color, like all the different groups that are in that, right? So that's just an encouragement for us to think critically as we're entering these discussions. And again, this is going to be hard. There might be times that you feel like your worldview is starting to crumble. It's good for us to grow, even though growth hurts sometimes. If we're not willing to get messy or make some mistakes or make some adjustments, you might not be ready for this group yet, and that's okay. When you're ready, you can come back. But we have to be at a point where we're ready to do that, where we're ready to say, learn new information and then change based on that. And I've been thinking about this in the term, a way that I have been able to understand it, I guess, as I'm seeing some white people wrestle through, it feels like their whole worldview is crumbling. And so again, that fear coming out, or how could you say this if I've been lied to my whole life, and a lot of anger. And that's okay, and that's natural. But for me, like earlier I said, I was planning to go to the Middle East. I've had a lot of Muslim friends, even in America. And this is something that I think as the church, as we naturally think about missions overseas, and as we think about sharing the gospel with Muslims, we easily acknowledge as Americans that Muslims have been told a certain reality and history and stories with a certain narrative that's not necessarily true, right? It's actually based on a lot of lies, but they've lived in that, and that's all they've known. And so when they come out of that and they come to America and they start making friends with Christians, and I'm sharing the gospel with them, and they're like, that's not true. Wait, what I was told about you're not like what I was told about Christians, right? And for them to accept the gospel, it takes time. It takes some deconstruction of this worldview that they've always believed, right? But I've seen my Muslim friends do that and become brothers and sisters in Christ. But that wasn't easy, and it was at a cost, right? Like their family say, what are you doing? You're changing, everything is different, but they're moving towards truth. And we would all say, yes, that's worth it. Go for it. But that's a stripping of their identity they didn't even know they had necessarily, because it's so woven into their culture and their worldview. Our whiteness is a lot like that in this instance, as we're learning new history, and we don't realize as white people much about our culture because we've lived in a dominant culture where what we say is normal is actually just white people. That's not normal, it's just our white worldview. So we're good at acknowledging other cultures, but we are very blind to our own culture because we just think it's normal. So we're not observing that, right? And so this is similar to that deconstruction of saying, oh, There are other ways that people see the world, and people have different experiences. And maybe some of the things that I was taught were coming from a cultural view, not necessarily a truth view, right? And so it can feel threatening, but truth is God's truth, and it's for us to grow. And so I don't know if that comparison is helpful or not, but it's been helpful for me. So yeah, there may be feelings of shock and confusion right now. Maybe thinking, why are all of a sudden we talking about this so much? But we've got to be able to move forward. And if you are feeling confused or shocked, or this is your first time entering some of these racial or injustice discussions, we have to acknowledge that things are not suddenly getting worse, that things are just finally entering your newsfeed, right? Nothing new has happened over the last 3 months. It's just repeating itself over and over. And so we have to go back to the beginning. We have to see what's happening now in the broader context of history. And so that's what we're going to do. And so again, like it's not too late. You're at the table. And so this is exciting and encouraging. Let's lean into that. But we have a lot to learn. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Sorry, this is a lot. I told you I was going to be talking a lot. Share my screen here so that we can do just some vocabulary. All right, let's see. So again, a lot of times we're having trouble in the conversation because we have different definitions. So we're just going to start here. I think most of this comes from Latasha Morrison, but throughout this study, I need y'all to know that I read a lot, I listen to podcasts a lot, I will drown you with research. So as I'm saying things, a lot of it is I may not remember the source, and so I can't take credit for it. But whenever possible, I'm going to point out like who it comes from. So most of this is from I don't think it's in the book, but Latasha Morrison. I've done a lot of her workshops and different things, and so I think most of this came from her. But there's a lot of research to come up with it. It's not like she defined this, but anyways, just wanted to be clear there. So ethnicity is natural, descriptive, social. It's based on our origins, family, culture, commonality. This is, think ethne or nations in scripture. This is not something new. This is how people have been described for as long as there's been different people, right? So it's just based on different people groups. We think of people groups as we're thinking missions and all that kind of stuff. That's what ethnicity is. But race is actually different. And this is really confusing to people when you say race is actually just a social and political construct. And you can go and do a ton of research on this. A short way for you to just get into the history of it is the Seeing White podcast. It's really great, breaks down the history of race in America. But the construction of race is based on outward appearance, but it was through like anthropologists and different people claiming biological difference among peoples, Black, white, indigenous, wasn't developed until the 17th century. So the concept of race and people being separated by race was not a thing until Europeans were trying to justify their doctrine of discovery and colonization and superiority of different people groups, right? And so Black didn't exist until white existed, right? And so it's actually very alarming when you go back and start looking at court cases in America from the beginning of cases where people were trying to prove if they were white or not, of how many drops of blood of different people of color do you have that disqualifies you from the privileges of being white. And so that's where we are. So race is real. We live in a racialized society, but it's not based on science, right? It's not we're not actually divided by this. Now, there are multiple ethnic differences between people groups, but race is not actually based on biology. So that helps us understand what is racism, because without the creation of race, there's not racism, right? So prejudice is something that has always existed, right? So negative opinion, feeling, action towards others based on their race or another perceived difference, right? So you can have prejudices against different religions, different race, different genders, all of that kind of stuff. So prejudice is something that all humans, from, that we get from earliest recorded history, deal with, right? Because we're sinful and we're impacted by the fall. But racism is different. Racism is a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. So prejudice plus misuse of power is what equals racism. Does that make sense? So it's a lot of times people say, well, what about Black people being racist to white people? That's not a full understanding of racism, because that would be prejudiced, right? But racism is how the systems that have been created, that for the specific purpose of superiority or keeping power within a certain people group. So that's where we're at when we're talking about racism. Now, where I think most of us in this group are going to have to do the most work is on implicit bias. So if you're a believer, nobody's walking around like, yeah, I'm a racist and I think we're better, right? Or I hate these people. Like, that's Christ. We have love, right? But we don't realize that they're actually how racism has impacted us, and that these implicit biases are in us, and they impact how we view the world. So implicit bias is unacknowledged view of a group of people. It's often directly opposed to our outward belief system. So it unknowingly impacts our choices. So the way this works is like how stereotypes impact how we view things and go about things. But again, so we might say, I love all people. God made all people equal, right? But we don't realize there's a fear that we have of someone who's different than us. This goes back to implicit bias. So Haley and I actually played around a lot with this when I first came to Oak Tree. And because there is a test that you can do online where they've done research on implicit biases and trying to understand how it impacts us as people. And so I was really suspicious of this, like, well, I can't prove this, whatever. It's, how can you prove that? But Haley and I both did it multiple times and tried our best to trick it. And then we really did some internal evaluation of our results. And we were like, oh, this is pretty accurate. And if we start to acknowledge how we feel in certain situations or why we act in these ways, it is based more on our implicit biases than what we would like to believe. So I'll send that link so you guys can do it later if you haven't done it yet. But for me, I'm full disclosure here, our team at Oak Tree, we've talked about this, but my implicit bias is against white men. So sorry to all of y'all in here, but acknowledging it and me learning that has helped me be very much more aware of, am I making this choice because I mistrust white men? Or am I making this choice for a good reason, just based on facts and something that needs to happen, right? And so that's something that I've had to evaluate, and it has helped me so much. I would have not said that before, but it helped me realize, like, that's my bias. Anyways, so then, as we were talking about racism, might be confused, like, well, where does that leave racist if we're talking about it's a structure, racism as a structure? So let's break that down between individual racism and systemic or institutionalized racism. So within, again, racism is a structure of prejudice plus power. And so individuals can be racist, right? So this is what we're most familiar with in the white circle of personal thoughts or actions. So this can be conscious or unconscious, but we think of people having racial slurs and saying different things and having negative views on that. But this is where we miss it a lot, and we've got to learn more about is the systemic and institutionalized racism. So this is how our policies and practices as a nation have been structured to benefit white men in reality, and whiteness as a people group. So again, I've said it 1,000 times, but we live in a racialized society. We don't have a choice. It's just how America has been. But we don't need to confuse racial terrorist with racist. So a lot of times people are like, well, I'm not racist. Why do I need to talk about this? Because what comes to mind is rebel flag, racial slurs, KKK, the worst thing. And that's racial terrorism, right? If we think about Birmingham in the 60s, that is terrorism against Black people. Let's not get confused by that. Someone can be a racist and be impacted by racism, have biases, have prejudices, and not be a terrorist, right? It doesn't have to be that extreme. The majority are probably not that extreme, while there very much are still racial terrorists today in America. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. So these two quotes I think are just important on this is being a non-racist isn't enough to end racism. If we are not actively anti-racist, we are complicit. So what we're going to be talking through this book is how to be anti-racist, right? And so this next quote kind of breaks down a little bit. Again, it's directed at white people because as we see racism and systemic racism, that's a white people problem that we've been a part of, whether we've known it or not. We're in a racialized society. So racist white people weaponize their privilege against others. Non-racist white people withhold their privilege from others. And anti-racist white people leverage their privilege for others. And so that's where we want to be in this group, is learning how to leverage our privilege for other people. So like I said earlier, privilege is not this curse word, okay? Everyone is really quick to say, what a privilege to be a citizen of the United States. It is a privilege. Well, before the last few months, it's been a privilege to hold a United States passport. It won't get you very far now, but in the past, it's been a privilege to be an owner of a United States passport. It just is. That's a good thing. We have religious freedom, all of that kind of stuff, right? Unfortunately, the way America has been structured, though, has elevated privilege of white people while at the same time, sorry, mute my phone, at the same time withholding some of those privileges from people of color. This does not mean that people of color have any less power or ability or any less value of white people. It's not to minimize them, it's to hold accountable the structures of our nation and how it's been. So yeah, we want to be learning how to leverage that privilege so that others can also have that. So I'm going to look at a couple of pictures here because right now everyone's talking about justice and inequality and what does this mean. So inequality. Oh, hang on. The way you're not able to see this on the recording the way that you guys are on my screen here. Let me try to move it. Okay, there we go. So inequality is unequal access to opportunities. Quality, evenly distributed tools and assistance. Equity, custom tools that identify and address inequality. And justice, fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. Let me put all these where we can look at them all at once. So again, we have a high theology of sin. We know that the world is fallen and broken. We know that we're not naively expecting and demanding a utopian society, right? Like this isn't. We have a sober reality that until Christ returns, there is not going to be full justice. But that does not remove the requirement that God has put on us as his people to strive for justice while we're on earth. And so this picture was just helpful for me to to have this visual and to know it's possible to work towards justice. I think a lot of times as Americans, we have a scary and limited view of justice. We think, and Brian Stevenson with the Equal Justice Initiative talks a lot about this. If you haven't watched Just Mercy, watch it. I suggest reading the book. But anyways, he does a lot of justice work, but talks about how in America when we hear justice, we think punitive. We think we're demanding punishment. And so it makes sense to me that people right now are like, no, we don't want to talk about justice because we're terrified, especially as we're talking about Black and white inequality. White people are like, nope, nope, don't talk about it. Because we have an understanding of justice of that we deserve punishment. We think they're saying, we're going to punish you for everything you've done. But if we have a biblical view of justice with restoration, restorative justice, there's a lot of hope there, right? Now, God is a just God, and there is punishment for sin. But Christ has offered us justification. So we do not have to fear justice. It is a very scary thing to talk about justice outside of the gospel. It is. There's no good news in justice because someone has been wronged and someone needs punishment. That's just the reality. But in Christ, he's taken that punishment. So we can talk about justice with freedom and with joy because we can start to reflect his kingdom. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Justice and righteousness are the footstool of our King. So as a people of God, it is good and right for us to work towards justice. He says, what does the Lord require of you? Do justice, right? So this is the heartbeat behind Oak Tree. We've come into a space that is completely unequal, right? And we've said, how can we start to bring in resources and access to address this? But for us to be able to work towards justice locally, just thinking about our own city, that's really complicated and messy because everything that we just learned with institutionalized racism, there's a lot of layers towards justice and towards moving this barrier. But again, there's hope. People of God, the church, should give hope to the world that a new community, the beloved community, is possible. So again, I hope that clarifies a little bit for you. That visual was good for me. So again, I talked a lot, sorry. But guys, this is not a sprint or a marathon. This is a relay race, okay? We know we're in it for the long run, but we've just been passed the baton. We didn't create this, we didn't ask for it, but we have been born into a certain point in history, in God's redemptive history, for a purpose. And we have knowingly or unknowingly been a part of upholding it. And so the baton has been passed to us. What are we going to do? And that's what this group is for us to learn together and to strive towards a unified body, a church that begins to reflect God's heart of justice in the world and makes a difference in the communities that we're in, not just sitting idly by, but impacts community for justice. So again, that was a lot. But I also want to encourage you as you go on this journey and as we're learning things every week, bring somebody on this journey with you who do you need to share what you're learning new each week with? Because if you go on this journey alone, you're all of a sudden going to be really lonely in your communities and look around and say, wait, nobody knows what I'm talking about. And that's where I found myself year or two ago, and was like, oh boy, I've been learning on my own, and that's really selfish. God calls us to be disciplers who pass on when we learn new information, share it with other people. And so be thinking each week as we go through this, who does God want me to share what I've learned with for the next group? So let's see if I got everything. I think that's all. I'm going to stop recording so that we can chat if I can figure out how to stop recording. Here we go.